My stepfather told me I'd been disinherited. He showed me the will, signed, notarized, airtight. I spent 5 years believing my mother had cut me out. Then a hospice nurse showed up at my door with a certified copy of a different will. My mother had signed it 3 days before she died, naming me the sole beneficiary. She'd foreseen everything, and she'd chosen her witness carefully. This is Maria. For 5 years, she believed her mother Carol had cut her out. The truth, Carol had foreseen Edward's betrayal and trusted only one person, her hospice nurse, Margaret. That trust would unravel a half-decade of deception. It all began with a signature, 3 days before Carol died. 3 days before Carol died, she pressed a pen into her shaking hand and signed her name on a document that would change everything. The only witness in the room was Margaret, the hospice nurse who had been caring for her for 6 weeks. Carol looked Margaret in the eyes and said, "Hide this, he can't know it exists." To understand why a dying woman was hiding legal documents from her own husband, you have to go back to when the diagnosis came. April of 2019. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 6 months to live, maybe less. Carol was 62. She'd been remarried to Edward for 11 years. Maria was her only daughter from her first marriage, and the two of them were close. They talked every Sunday. Maria lived 40 minutes away, visited when she could, but Edward was always there, hovering, managing, controlling the narrative. In those first months after the diagnosis, Maria noticed the shift. Phone calls went unanswered. Visits got harder to schedule. Edward always had a reason. Carol was resting, Carol was too tired, the doctors said, to limit stimulation. What Maria didn't know was that Edward had already convinced Carol to revise her will. The new version, drafted in August of 2019, left the house in Manchester, the savings account with $84,000, everything to Edward as sole beneficiary. Maria was written out entirely. Edward had told Carol it was simpler this way, that Maria would understand, that it would avoid probate complications. Carol, foggy from medication and dependent on Edward for daily care, had signed it. But here's the thing. As Carol's illness progressed and a hospice team was assigned, she began to regain a sliver of clarity. Margaret came every Tuesday and Thursday. She wasn't just a nurse, she was a listener. And in quiet moments when Edward was out running errands, Carol started to talk. She told Margaret about the will, about how she'd been pressured, about her daughter, Maria, the elementary school teacher who had done nothing wrong except trust her mother. Carol's biggest fear, she said, was that Edward would erase her memory from the house she'd raised Maria in. So on February 14th, 2020, 3 days before she stopped eating, Carol made a decision. She asked Margaret to call a mobile notary. That afternoon, with trembling hands and a voice barely above a whisper, she dictated a new will. It revoked all prior documents. It left the house and the savings to Maria, with a small gift to Margaret for her honesty. The will was signed, notarized, and witnessed. Margaret was given one certified copy. The original was placed in a safety deposit box that Edward didn't know about. And then, as if holding on for just that moment, Carol slipped into her final decline. She died on February 17th. Edward, dry-eyed, handled the arrangements. At the reading of the will, he presented the August version. Maria sat in the attorney's office, numb with grief, as she heard the words, "I leave everything to my husband, Edward." She felt the floor collapse. Edward looked at her and said, "I'm sorry, your mother had her reasons." Maria never questioned it. She packed up a few keepsakes from the house and left. Edward stayed. The probate closed within 3 months. For 5 years, Maria believed she'd been cut out by the one person she trusted most. She replayed every conversation, searching for what she'd done wrong. She drove past the Manchester house on the anniversary of Carol's death each year, just to feel close to her mother's memory, even if the house no longer belonged to her. She told herself she'd made peace with it. She hadn't. And then, on a gray Tuesday in March, Maria received a message from someone she hadn't heard from in half a decade. It was Nurse Margaret. The message read, "I need to talk to you about your mother's true will. I've kept a copy all these years." Maria stared at her phone, her heart racing. The past was about to come crashing back, and nothing Edward had buried would stay buried any longer. Maria met Margaret at a diner off Route 3 the next morning. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers and a waitress who refilled coffee without asking. Margaret looked older than Maria remembered, grayer, more tired. But her eyes held the same quiet resolve they'd carried in Carol's final days. She slid a manila envelope across the table without a word. Inside was a certified copy of a will, dated February 14th, 2020, 3 days before Carol died. Notarized, witnessed, and stapled to it a handwritten letter in her mother's unmistakable looping script. The letter began, "Maria, if you're reading this, Edward has probably told you I left you nothing. That's a lie. He tried to isolate me from you in my last months. He pushed me to sign an earlier will. I was weak and afraid, but I found the strength to fix it. This will is my true wish. The house you grew up in is yours, the savings are yours, do not let him take what I built for you, and know that I love you always." Maria broke down in the booth, right there between the salt shaker and the maple syrup. Margaret reached across and held her hand. "I wanted to come forward sooner," she said, "but I had to be careful. Edward made threats. He told me if I interfered, he'd ruin my career. 5 years I held on to this, hoping the right moment would come. Last month, I heard he's planning to sell the house. I couldn't wait anymore." That detail, the house being sold, ignited something in Maria. The house on Beach Street where she'd learned to ride a bike, where her mother painted watercolors in the sunroom, where every floorboard held a memory. Edward was going to cash out and disappear. Maria took the envelope, thanked Margaret, and drove straight to a probate attorney she'd found online that morning. The attorney, a sharp woman named Elaine Rixey, reviewed the documents for 2 hours. She compared signatures, checked the notary stamp, verified dates. When she came back into the conference room, her expression was serious but optimistic. "This will is authentic," she said. "It postdates the August version by 6 months. It explicitly revokes all prior wills." And the letter, Maria, that letter is a ticking time bomb for Edward. It documents his isolation tactics, which could support an elder abuse claim. "We can reopen probate. It won't be easy, but we have grounds." There were problems, though, statutes of limitation. In Maria's state, probate challenges typically had to be filed within 3 years of the will being admitted. They were at 5. But Elaine cited case law where fraud told the deadline. If Edward knowingly probated a will he knew was revoked, and that was exactly what the evidence suggested, the clock might not have started running. The deception itself kept the case alive. But here's the deeper complication. Edward wasn't some distant, uninvolved widower. He was still living in Carol's house, paying the taxes, maintaining the property, and he'd spent 5 years believing the estate was settled. To him, this wouldn't just be a legal dispute, it would feel like an ambush. And people like Edward, people who'd gone to elaborate lengths to control a narrative, didn't surrender quietly. Elaine sent a demand letter to Edward's attorney on a Friday afternoon. It outlined the existence of the later will, attached the certified copy, and requested voluntary transfer of the estate assets to Maria within 30 days. The alternative was formal legal action, a petition to reopen probate, a fraud complaint, and possible criminal referral. The letter landed like a bomb. On Monday, Maria's phone rang. It was Edward. She hadn't heard his voice in 3 years. He didn't yell, he didn't threat. He spoke softly, the way you'd speak to a child you were about to correct. "Maria, what are you doing? Your mother was confused at the end. That will was written under duress from that nurse. You know your mother loved me. Don't let this destroy her memory." He paused. "If you push this, I'll fight. And I'll win. I have resources you can't match. Drop it now and I'll give you a few $1,000s. Enough to take a nice vacation, think about it." Maria hung up without answering, but his words burrowed into her. What if he was right? What if her mother's illness had made her vulnerable to suggestion? What if Margaret had manipulated her? The doubt was insidious, exactly what Edward intended. She called Elaine and asked the question that was eating at her. Could this will actually be invalid? Elaine's answer was firm. "The notary's journal entry shows your mother was alert and oriented. The witness, Margaret, has a clean record and no financial interest in the estate beyond a small token gift. And the letter in your mother's handwriting confirms her state of mind. I've had handwriting experts preliminarily review it. They'll testify it's authentic. Edward is trying to gaslight you, Maria. Don't let him." That word, gaslight, snapped Maria back to clarity. She'd spent 5 years doubting herself, wondering why she'd been cut out. Now she had documentary proof that her mother had fought to include her. She told Elaine to proceed. They filed the petition to reopen probate on April 2nd. The filing triggered a 60-day response window. Edward's attorney immediately moved to dismiss, arguing the statute of limitations had expired and that Maria lacked standing. But Elaine had anticipated this. She filed an opposition brief that included the letter, the notary's testimony, and Margaret's sworn affidavit detailing Edward's threats. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd seen more than one family estate spiral into ugliness, denied the motion to dismiss and set an evidentiary hearing for June. What Edward didn't know, what made Maria's case even stronger, was that Margaret had kept more than just the will. She'd kept contemporaneous notes from her hospice visits. Documentation of Edward's behavior. Mentions of how he'd screen Carol's calls from Maria. Notes about Carol asking for Maria at times when Edward claimed she was too tired for visitors. This wasn't just a probate dispute anymore. It was a record of systematic isolation that bordered on elder abuse, and it was about to come out in open court. Maria sat in her apartment the night before the hearing, the letter from her mother open on her lap. She read the final line again, and know that I love you always. She finally believed it. Tomorrow she would walk into a courtroom and demand the truth be honored. But Edward was waiting too, and he had one last card to play. The hearing was set for 9 in the morning at the probate court in Manchester. The room was wood-paneled, small, with a faint smell of old paper and floor wax. Maria sat at a table on the left with Elaine. Margaret was in the gallery, her hands folded. Edward sat at the right table with his attorney, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he billed by the minute. Edward's eyes swept past Maria as if she were a stranger. He'd aged. His jaw was tighter than she remembered. The judge called the case and Elaine stood first. She walked the court through the timeline step by step. The August will, the February will, the notary's journal, the witness, the letter. She submitted the certified copy into evidence. She called Margaret to the stand. Margaret described the afternoon of February 14th, how Carol had been alert, even animated after weeks of fog. She asked me to make sure Maria got her home, Margaret said, voice steady. She was scared Edward would throw her daughter out of the house forever. Then Edward's attorney rose for cross-examination. He attacked immediately. Nurse Margaret, isn't it true that you befriended my client's late wife in order to extract a gift for yourself? The will names you as receiving $5,000. That's a tidy sum for a hospice nurse. Margaret's expression didn't waver. I didn't know about the gift until the will was read to me years later. I didn't ask for it. And if it mattered to me, I would have come forward the moment she died, not waited 5 years while that man lived in a house that wasn't his. The judge nodded slightly. Elaine then called the notary, a retired woman who had kept meticulous records. The journal entry for February 14th noted, signer alert, oriented, aware of document contents, no signs of coercion, witness present. It was a small detail, but legally it was a wall. Edward's attorney tried to argue that cancer had diminished Carol's capacity, but the notary's testimony undermined him. The letter itself, Carol's handwriting, was read aloud. The line that cut deepest. He tried to isolate me from you in my last months. The judge asked Edward's attorney if he had any evidence that the letter was forged. He said they needed more time for expert analysis. The judge denied a continuance, but then Edward took the stand himself. He spoke calmly, sorrowfully. I loved Carol. I cared for her every day. She was confused at the end, paranoid. That nurse put ideas in her head. Maria wasn't around enough to see it. He looked directly at Maria for the first time. I tried to protect your mother's dignity. This will, it's not what she wanted. She told me she was leaving everything to me because I was her husband. I built a life with her. Maria's stomach turned, but she could see the cracks. Edward's narrative contradicted the notary's records, the letter, Margaret's account. He was the only one who remembered things that way. Elaine's rebuttal was surgical. She submitted Margaret's contemporaneous hospice notes. One entry, dated December 11th, read, patient expressed desire to see daughter. Husband said she was too tired. Patient became tearful. Another, from January 6th, patient asked if she could change her will. Husband said there was no need. Patient seemed distressed. These notes painted a picture of systematic isolation. They were not hearsay, they were medical records. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to intent. Then came the moment that broke the case open. Elaine had subpoenaed phone records. They showed that in Carol's final 3 months, Edward had blocked Maria's number from Carol's phone on multiple occasions. He'd also canceled visits that Maria had scheduled, claiming Carol was sleeping. Maria hadn't known about the cancellations until the records were pulled. She'd thought her mother was too sick to talk. The isolation was deliberate. Edward's attorney requested a recess. They returned with an offer. Edward would vacate the house within 60 days and transfer the remaining savings to Maria, but he wanted no admission of wrongdoing and no criminal referral. Elaine looked at Maria. The house and the savings were what Carol wanted for her daughter, but a settlement without fraud on the record wouldn't hold Edward accountable. Maria asked for a moment. She stepped into the hallway and called Margaret, who was waiting outside. What do I do? Maria asked. Margaret's voice was quiet. Your mother wanted you safe, not fighting forever. Take the house. The truth is already in the court record, that's enough. He'll live with what he did. Maria returned and told Elaine, accept the settlement. Edward would leave. He would sign a quitclaim deed. The savings account, originally 84,000, had been depleted to about 41,000 after years of Edward's management. He agreed to return the remaining balance. No criminal charges, but the civil record would note that a later will was found and the estate redistributed. The judge approved the agreement and vacated the prior probate order. The house on Beach Street was Maria's. As Edward walked out of the courtroom, he passed Margaret in the gallery. She didn't look at him. Maria watched him go, feeling not triumph but a profound, exhausted relief. But the story didn't end there. The letter Carol wrote contained a postscript that Maria had missed on first reading, buried on the back page in smaller handwriting. It said, "I know what Edward did, I forgive him, but I need you to know so you can never doubt that I chose you. He isolated me but I found my way back. That nurse Margaret was my lifeline, honor her." That was the twist. Carol hadn't died bitter. She had died clear-eyed, having reclaimed her voice in the final hours. And she had left a gift for the woman who helped her. True to the settlement, Edward moved out by May 30th. Maria drove to the house on a Saturday morning with a box of cleaning supplies and a heavy heart. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the walls were bare, the furniture gone, but the wooden floors still creaked in the same spots. The sunroom where Carol painted was empty but filled with light. Maria stood there and let herself cry. And Margaret received her gift. Maria sent a check for $5,000 with a note. "My mother wanted you to have this, you kept your promise." Margaret framed the note. She still works as a hospice nurse. She says that case reminded her why documentation matters, why nurses are often the last line of defense for vulnerable patients. And Maria, she moved into the house the following month. She planted the same roses Carol had always kept by the front walk. Every spring, they bloom in pale pink, and she thinks of her mother, not of the years lost, but of the 3 days before death when a woman who had been silenced wrote one last truth and trusted a stranger to carry it home. Edward didn't vanish. He moved to a one-bedroom apartment in Nashua, 30 miles away, and told anyone who'd listen that he'd been robbed by a vindictive stepdaughter and a scheming nurse. But the court record told a different story, and probate rulings are public. Word spread through Carol's old circle. The church friends, the neighbors, the women she'd played bridge with. Invitations dried up. Edward's version of events couldn't survive the documentary evidence that had been read into the official record. He'd tried to bury a dying woman's last wish, and he'd failed. That kind of knowledge doesn't just stay in a courtroom. It follows you to the grocery store, to the diner, to the park bench where you used to sit with your wife on Sunday afternoons. Maria never pressed for criminal charges. The settlement had been clear. He vacated, he returned what remained of the savings, and the past was legally closed. But the closure Maria needed wasn't legal, it was emotional. She spent the first summer in her mother's house, painting the rooms herself, stripping away the beige Edward had chosen, and finding the colors Carol had loved. Sage green in the kitchen, buttery yellow in the sunroom. She hung Carol's watercolors on the walls, the ones he'd taken down and stored in the basement. It felt like reclaiming a territory, one brushstroke at a time. But it wasn't until August that the final detail surfaced, the one that changed how Maria understood everything that had happened. Margaret called and asked if she could come by the house. She'd been reluctant to return, too many memories. But she had something she'd been holding onto, something she hadn't even mentioned in court, and she felt it was time. Maria made tea. They sat in the sunroom, and Margaret placed a small digital recorder on the table between them. "Your mother asked me to tape a message for you," she said. "She was too weak to write everything she wanted to say. I never knew if I should give it to you, but I think you're ready." Margaret pressed play. Carol's voice emerged, thin and labored but unmistakable. She spoke of winter mornings when Maria was small, of the way her daughter laughed as a child, of her pride in the woman Maria had become. She said she knew Edward had tried to isolate her, but she'd held on to the secret of the will because Margaret had given her the courage. She ended with 6 words that reframed everything. "I was never not fighting for you." Maria let the recording play 3 times. Then she hugged Margaret for a long time. That was the final twist. Carol hadn't just signed a document in her last days. She'd left a voice, a testament of intention that no one could manipulate. It wasn't evidence anymore, it was inheritance in the deepest sense. That afternoon, Maria took the recorder to the backyard, where Carol's roses were in full bloom. She played it again, just for herself, and let her mother's voice float through the August air. She realized that grief, when it's finally untangled from betrayal, isn't the enemy, it's just love with nowhere to go. And she finally had a place to put it. The house, the roses, the message. Her mother had returned, not as a ghost, but as a presence that Edward had never been able to erase. There are an estimated 40% of American adults with at least one step relative, and in those blended families, inheritance disputes are now one of the most common forms of probate litigation. What happened to Maria is not rare. It's just rarely documented so completely. The nurse who kept notes, the notary who kept a journal, the mother who, in her final lucid hours, wrote a letter and recorded a message. This case didn't resolve because Maria got lucky. It resolved because Carol, in the last 3 days of her life, built a fortress of evidence around her true intentions. And she placed that fortress in the hands of the one person Edward couldn't control, the hospice nurse. Margaret broke no laws, violated no protocols. She simply witnessed, documented, and waited. That 5-year waiting period is what makes this story chilling. How many people never get that knock on the door? How many estates settle in silence, with the real will buried, the real heir never knowing? If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Maria's place? And if you believe the truth can outlast even the most careful deception, share this video with someone who needs to hear it.